Linear is a word that doesn't conjure many positive feelings. It brings to mind an idea of a set path unable to be changed, like an on-rails game found at an arcade where pointing and pulling a trigger is as deep as gameplay might get. The idea of a linear game is almost sneered at, as if the idea of an open world will automatically make a game better, bigger, and more enjoyable, or that simply using the term open world will make the game sell better. But if I think back to some of my formative years in gaming, a lot of what I would consider my favourite titles were linear games. Call of Duty 4, Halo 3, BioShock, but somewhere along the way, linear became a bad word. The trend of everything having to be an open world, no matter the quality of the world in question, would truly begin in the years that followed. This was before gaming had really started to stagnate as it has in recent years, so when it was announced that the next title in your favourite series was going to be open world, people were excited. Surely this meant the game would now contain a living and breathing open world, Skyrim for the first-person shooter, and a sense of scale that came with it. Instead we saw the birth of the half-baked open world, games with plenty of walking but not much to see, games with wildlife but where nothing felt alive. These games had gone open world not because the series really needed it, but because executives thought it was more marketable. Similar to how the release of 2018's PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds and later Fortnite meant that every game needed a battle royale, even if the community were apprehensive at best and outright hostile at worst. That's not to say that an open world is inherently a bad thing. In fact, it can be great as long as love and care has been put into crafting it. Oblivion, Fallout New Vegas, Red Dead Redemption and Grand Theft Auto all spring to mind as some of my favourites, but these games were built from the ground up with an open world in mind and felt alive, and were the opposite of open world for openness sake. Imagine a Red Dead Redemption game without the ability to ride your horse across the open plains, and what would Fallout be without your ability to walk anywhere and pick up anything? And that brings us back to linear games. How do you compete with the perfect open world?
Pay with your blood!
Well, it's going to be hard, but you can pull on one advantage that most open worlds will struggle to compete with, and that is intentional decision making and attention to detail. I recently finished Space Marine 2, which was the inspiration behind this video, and while it's not an open world and relatively short at 9 to 10 hours, I was left in awe at the game's attention to detail, world building and feel. With a smaller scale game like this, developers have the time to craft each environment the player sees. The placement of each tree or rock has been done by hand and has been put there deliberately in order to fulfill a purpose from a story or gameplay perspective. What the player can see is at the forefront of the developers' minds at all times. There's no concern about adding a tiny detail in the corner of the map that most players will never see or pay attention to, because everything they place is almost guaranteed to be encountered by the player. As the game has linear progression, the developers will know where the player will be at any given time and what challenges they face. That certainty means they have greater control over the flow and pacing of the game. They know when the player has access to a new weapon because they're the ones that gave it to you. They don't have to worry that you've been off on some side quest and found a brand new mega sword that can cleave its way through any challenge in early parts of the game, and they can tailor the environment and challenges around your new toy. The benefit of linear levels is that you can tell an intricate story and know exactly what the player has and hasn't seen. You don't have to worry that the reveal of a new enemy might have already been spoiled in some random cave somewhere, so you know that the reveal is still going to be cool. They similarly don't have to worry that the player has taken a break from the main quest and forgotten what's going on. But that's also their main disadvantage, as if players can't deviate from the developer's intended path, if they get bored they can't just go and do a side quest or something else. They have to keep going down the designated route or stop playing the game, which means your story has to be good. But just because a game is linear, that doesn't mean it's a corridor shooter where you just run forward in a straight line. This is where level design is important, and linear games can incorporate some of the best features of an open world without running into all the problems that they face. Halo 3's mission The Ark is a great example of this. While the mission starts and remains on a linear path throughout, how you choose to take on a given challenge is up to you. After a heavily guided opening segment with a sniper rifle, you eventually arrive at the level's open rolling sand dunes. Now it's greatly encouraged for you to take a vehicle here, with the developers even going so far as to put one right in front of your face, but there's nothing stopping you from hoofing it on foot. Later on, if you do choose to take a vehicle, you can have anyone you like. Fancy jumping in a tank for massive damage, or would you prefer to get in the weaker but faster and more manoeuvrable Ghost? Even though the level is linear in that your starting and ending locations are set, how you choose to get between them is up to you. And these areas are so wide open they don't feel constricted or small like you would typically think when using the word linear. This is what I would call a semi-open world. The game is still dictated by levels levels but allows the player to explore and find hidden details on each map. Similarly in Space Marine 2, a game much more linear and on rails than Halo 3, the world can still feel large and alive, even if the explorable area is small. I might be stuck on this path with my own enemies to fight, but I can still look across and see a war going on in the background. In fact, I can even shoot into the distance and kill enemies. And while it might not have an impact on the outcome of the mission, this feels like a true war zone where the fate of a planet is at stake. When you see thousands of bugs pouring over the horizon, it looks awesome, but that gets even better when you realise it's not just a background. This horde is actually getting closer to you, so firing at them from range is a good idea to try and thin their numbers and stop you getting overwhelmed. This gives the game a blockbuster feeling. Whether you think that's a good thing depends on what you play games for. Are you primarily here for the story, or is the gameplay most important? If the developers can nail both, that's when you get something really quite special. We all know deep down when playing a game that there's nothing behind the visuals we see, just an unrendered void, but the beauty of crafting a game is making the player believe this is real. What's behind that door, or over the top of that hill? What happens if the gun emplacement falls? Suspension of disbelief is important, and with tailored environments you really feel that, something that most open world games fail to match, at least on a grand scale. A lot of open world games generate their terrain using AI, and there's nothing that puts me off a game quicker than a press release saying it's going to have over 1,000 explorable planets, because you and me both know that those 1,000 planets are going to be terrible. Copy and pasted terrain with maybe a couple of outposts if you're lucky, with absolutely nothing to see in between. And once you've left the area, you'll never visit them again, or even remember them, as they all start to blur together. And that's the problem with bad open worlds. Whether they're generated or lazily crafted by hand, they feel boring, and they remind you this is a video game. Walking around a town and seeing an NPC playing the same animation over and over again while spouting the same lines of dialogue isn't fun for anyone, while running between locations just to get to the next story mission is pointless if you don't stop and actually enjoy the world. But if that world doesn't feel real or even enjoyable, then the developers are wasting both of your time. Yours by making you run through it, and theirs by having to make it in the first place. I dread to think how many hours have been painstakingly spent crafting items in open worlds that nobody has ever paid attention to. The developers probably spent more time looking at it than anyone else, and that's just sad. Let's compare the open world of Halo Infinite to the original linear Halo Combat Evolved. Halo Infinite might look prettier, and I'd be surprised if it wasn't coming out 2 decades later, but the map is terrible. It's been a few years since I've played the campaign of Infinite, but I couldn't tell you anything that stands out in my memory apart from the hexagon-style terrain. Where are the snow-covered mountains, swamps, or vast deserts? Halo Combat Evolved had these 20 years ago, and okay, they look a bit dated by today's standards, but this world feels more like a real place than the shiny new one of 2021. Combat Evolved's missions all have their own distinct identity. The scope might be smaller, but they still feel big enough to explore while telling a solid story over a number of levels. Again, these are linear missions in the same open world style of Halo 3, but Halo Infinite has linear missions too. You just have to travel through the open world to get to them, and seeing more of a world that doesn't have any distinct identity actually makes the game worse, not better. Using the age-old term of less is more, Combat Evolved's levels let you imagine what the rest of the world might look like, and that's actually more fun than seeing a generic forgettable map, as that robs you of your ability to dream. I used to have a rule that I wanted to have an hour of playtime for every pound or dollar that I spent on a game. Think of it as a return on investment. But as time has gone on, the pendulum has swung the other way. Of course, I still want value for my money. The more hours of enjoyment I get out of my purchase, the better, but quality of hours matters too. I rarely buy games for full price these days, but even though Space Marine 2 is only 9 or 10 hours long, I would have no problem purchasing it for full price, because the quality of those few hours is incredible, and the developers that make games of this nature should be supported. What use is a 100-hour game if I only enjoyed the first 20 hours and the rest I spent running around doing uninteresting busy work? I don't have time to waste, and neither do you, so let's get rid of the rubbish and only keep what's actually worth playing. A good open world is incredible, but a bad one can ruin an otherwise good game. That's not to say that bad linear games don't exist. Just because the developers have the tools to make something great, it doesn't mean they will. But tacking on an open world to an already established franchise is not the silver bullet that developers seem to think it is. If companies don't want to spend the time making these open worlds believable, then they just shouldn't make them. Everyone loves the GTAs and the Fallout New Vegases of gaming, but that's because these companies take their time to make their games and spend the money required to do so. Red Dead 2 took 8 years to make, and most studios simply do not have the resources required to make games like that, even if they wanted to. That's not to say that big linear games are quick or cheap to produce either. Serious time and money has gone into making Space Marine 2 what it is, and it shows, and it's my favourite game of this year. It's time to repair the reputation of the linear game, not as something bad or stuck on on rails, but as an intentional design choice to craft the optimal experience for the player. Let's not forget that a lot of our favourite games wouldn't exist without them. Linear games are good, actually. And special thanks to my patrons, Asmodeus Mateus, Graham DeLoye, Baron Windy, and Immortal for making this video possible.